Sue.
Thank you, Carrie. I, too, would like to welcome you all to this webinar, and thanks, Carrie, for the introduction. I also want to thank Angie for providing the closed captioning today. And Carrie asked if you could say where you're participating from today. If you could also let us know if there's more than one of you at your site, and if there is more than one of you, if you could tell us how many, that would be really helpful. So thanks. As Carrie said, I'm Sujata, and I'm with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, located here in very hot Philadelphia. And we're really glad that you've joined us today. This is the 7th in our series of webinars from our project on ending mass incarceration, centralizing racial justice, and developing alternatives, the role of anti-domestic violence and sexual assault programs. And before I go further, I really want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their support of this webinar and for the support of what I think is a very important project. As you're probably aware, today we're doing a follow-up to the webinar that our speaker, Sujata Baliga, did with us at the end of April. And that one was called, as is this one, Exploring Restorative Justice to Address Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence, Centering the Wisdom, Needs, and Safety of Survivors. So if we can move, maybe Carrie or thank you. I can move it for some reason. Anyway, thank you very much. And in an effort to save time, I mean, we have the bio there, and I'm going to do a very brief introduction, which is actually really hard for me because she's such an important person to me. I mean, as you can see from the slide today, she is, for those of you who are on the webinar, Sujata is currently the director of the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice, which is in Oakland, and she's also the vice president there. You can also see that she was a victim advocate, a public defender, and a Soros Justice Fellow. And I said this same thing during the last webinar, but I want to say it again because the slide just doesn't say so much about Sujata. I mean, she really is an internationally known thought leader, and she's been really instrumental in helping people around the world to think differently and much more creatively about what justice might look like, what justice could look like. She's a delight. She's super smart. She's passionate. And she's also so willing to put herself out there in these unbelievably courageous ways. She does this work with her head, she does it with her heart, and she does it with her soul. And I've been lucky enough to know her for a really long time. She was a law intern here with us at the National Clearinghouse way back in 1999. And I have to say my love and respect for her grows every time I get to connect with her. And that's really true. There's so much more that I could say, but I'm not going to because we want to give her time to talk. Just before we jump in, I just want to say that as Carrie mentioned earlier, I know some of you have joined after she finished her remarks, I'll be collecting additional questions for Sujata down in the chat box, and we're going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end of this presentation for additional questions. So we'll do the best we can to get to your questions, so feel free to put the questions in the chat box. And as Carrie mentioned earlier, if you're joining us via phone only today, you can send your questions to Dot, and it's DOT at ncdbw.org, and she'll pass them on to me. Carrie also mentioned that you'll be getting a short evaluation, and it really is helpful to us and to the speaker if you'll fill it out, so we hope that you will. So Sujata, thanks so much for coming back and talking with us more about your important work. So I seem to be having a little difficulty advancing the slide. So if somebody there could do it. I think we missed, yeah, thank you very much. As we said in our advertisements about this webinar, we are not going to revisit what Sujata discussed in the first webinar, but rather we're using that webinar as a jumping off point for this webinar. What we did is we collected all the questions from the chat from the last webinar, and people added additional questions and comments in the evaluations, and we put those all together, and we came up with a bunch of questions that we thought covered most of the themes that came up in the questions. So why don't we dive in? So Sujata, if you can control the slides? Because I don't know why I can't seem to. That would be great.
I believe I can.
Okay.
Yep, there we go.
Okay.
So first I just want to mirror back everything Suo said about me. Thank you, Suo, for asking me to be a part of this conversation, and just really deeply appreciate the decades of camaraderie and mentorship that I've received from you, and super grateful to National Clearinghouse, to Battle Women's Justice Project, OVW, everybody who's been open to us discussing what for many decades has been very taboo, and which is the intersection of restorative justice and sexual violence, restorative justice and intimate partner violence. And I think that there's been a lot of really important concerns about what it would look like to apply restorative justice in these areas. And these questions that have been offered up from the last session really do speak to a lot of those. And I think it's really important that we answer them. So, you know, when you go to those trainings and somebody puts a big sticky thing on the wall and we call it the parking lot, and people write all their questions in there, and then the training goes so long and we never get back to the parking lot, right? I really hate that expression, the parking lot, because it does feel like we just parked our most important and juicy questions over there that we never get back to. So I'm really grateful for this time that we actually decided to do a whole other session on what is the parking lot. And I like to rename that thing the garden instead of the parking lot, because it gives us an opportunity to let these things grow. And so that's very much the spirit with which I'd like us to engage in these questions. We don't have the answers. This thing is evolving. It is both something that has been happening sort of naturally in families and communities forever, that people have figured out how to have family and community address intimate partner violence without reliance on the state, right? When we talked about, we're not going to repeat too much from last time, but we have talked about the fact that 50% of survivors don't contact the system, particularly in intimate partner violence, in the first place. And of the 50% who do, 20% say it made them less safe, right? And that's there are many studies that show this kind of information. And so what happens to those of us, and I would put myself very much in that us category, who don't contact the system? And what are some ways in which things have been sorted out sort of off the grid, or, you know, in our own families and communities? There's some wisdom there, too, that I think that could be grown and enhanced from deeper engagement with restorative justice principles and practices. But in thinking that through, here are some really important questions that have come up, right? And so the first one here is, how does restorative justice response ensure that survivors are fully informed and really participating voluntarily, right? This is a very important question. And so one of the challenges, there's going to be a whole lot of this expression, both and, both things that we need to hold simultaneously when we're talking about applying restorative justice to intimate partner violence and sexual harm. Both, there is often an urgency, right, particularly with ongoing and escalating violence, right, or where someone is in a position where they want to engage in restorative justice with something that's happened quite recently, and there's a great desire for something to happen to hold someone to account when the system isn't on offer, isn't safe for folks to engage with, or whether or not it's just something that people don't choose to engage, right? So there's this urgency that happens, but at the same time, I think we need to prioritize going slowly and going deeply in thinking about whether or not survivors truly understand what is being offered through a restorative justice process, and whether or not they are not being pressured into this, they're not being coerced into being engaged in a process. And just to clarify, there are lots of folks doing, applying restorative justice principles to working with survivors, to working with people who have done harm. And often that is in the context of, let's say, a domestic violence, a group for education around domestic violence in a prison, or a batterers intervention program that's starting to fold in restorative justice principles. What we're talking about here, and I think where a lot of these questions come from, is about the notion of doing face-to-face dialogue and participatory decision-making in which people are coming together. Family and community are working closely with both the person who's been harmed and the person who has done the harm in order to deal with past or ongoing sexual or intimate partner violence, right? So that's the context in which these questions are here, for those of you who are new to this conversation or don't remember that that's what we're talking about. So so going slowly and being sure that folks are participating voluntarily. So and really a lot of this is on the facilitator, right? So how knowledgeable are those who are holding space in both doing restorative justice in crimes of severe violence and knowledgeable about working in the arenas of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. This is really important, right? I think that there are a lot of people who feel that they have experience in one arena or not the other, either in restorative justice or in intimate partner violence, and they feel that they could go ahead and really hold these spaces down. And I think it's very important to have extensive experience in both areas before putting yourself in the position of being a facilitator. And that being said, it's another both facilitators who have this sort of dual set of experiences, right, working in restorative justice, and particularly in being able to sit in the circle and be really good at accountability, being really good at listening deeply to survivors and their needs, and simultaneously trusting the wisdom of survivors. This is something that I think can be new to those of us who come to the work of intimate partner violence. I'm sorry, those of us who have worked for a long time in intimate partner violence. So like I remember past advocacy jobs that I have had where we really were, to my mind, being trained to railroad survivors into testifying against their abusers, even when the survivor was like, I really think this is going to make me less safe, right? So this can be a shift when we come to the work of domestic violence with a particular orientation around having to protect survivors from their own collusion with the people that have harmed them, et cetera. So so this is I think a new piece around the work that restorative justice brings. So I'm going to pause for a second because I feel that there's a concern that the closed captioning isn't working. I just want to be sure that we are having folks able to see.
Yep, here we go. So we just had a little bit of fade out for the captioner, but it looks like she's back on and hearing us okay.
Okay, because we're hearing you really well.
Great. Okay, perfect. So so this is an important piece of the work with restorative justice. And what I think is so beautiful about this work is that it is often the first time that someone is asking the survivor, you know, what is your assessment of the situation and what do you need for your safety? And what do you need to feel that you are participating voluntarily? So this is really important. I think that there's also a different set of questions for the facilitator, right? So as we grow this work, there will be funding attached to it. This is really important, right? So when there's funding attached to a thing, there's often deliverables related to it. If we find ourselves as nonprofits, as facilitators, in the position of having to report back to a funder saying, we did 7 circles this year, we did 15 circles this year, where we brought people together, there is a danger that we will be pushing participants people to participate, right? So that's something we really have to check. And really what I want the funder community to think about at this point is, as we are beginning to explore this, right, to enter this as a learning community together, that we can walk away from this saying we held preparatory circles with survivors separate from those who've done harm, and what we discovered is that 75% of survivors chose not to participate in a face-to-face dialogue. And you know what? That would be okay. So it's really important for us to push back really hard against any sort of funding opportunity that for our nonprofits that want to push us to bring cases to conferencing or bring cases to circle. And I think that the other thing that I will repeatedly say in this work is that we have to know ourselves really well. This is true whether or not we as facilitators are survivors or not. And in a way, this isn't different from any other role, right? I met many prosecutors who sort of project their own unhealed stuff all over survivors. I've met many who don't, right? And so, so really a level of self-awareness about what it is that are our own internal stumbling blocks, I think is a really important piece. Our own fears that may be my fears that are not her fears or his fears, the survivor's fears, that might be my wisdom, or it might be just a rote way of my responding to something that either comes from my own life or from other cases that don't apply here. So those are some of the pieces that I think we need to think about fully informed. And really just the last thing I'll say on fully informed is fully informed of what, right? So I would say fully informed of everything that both I think that they need to know and also what they want to know, right? What else do they need to know in order to feel like this is something that they would want to do? And always being satisfied with the answer of, oh, knowing that, I need to pause, I need to wait, I need to pull back. But I think it's important for us also to be fully informed of what are all the consequences for participating in this that we can see, and without, again, layering our fears on top of their process, making sure that we share those in a way that lets people know what is on offer. So with that, I think I'll move to the next one. Except I can't, so maybe somebody else can. Oh, no, there it goes. What do we do about charismatic and manipulative folks who have done harm? And so I don't tend to use the word abusers, and we left the questions exactly as we had received them, and I want to be clear on a note on language here. So on the one hand, I want to honor the way the question was framed and to explain why it is that I don't use these labeling words for the most part. And sort of a conflict I have internally around that, because I do tend to use words like survivor and victim from time to time, but I don't tend to use them sort of on the other quote-unquote side, and I'll explain a little bit about why. So my mentors and my teachers really have shown me, particularly those who are indigenous, that these words don't exist in a lot of languages, these labels that leave people fixed in time, in part because it is a hope that folks can change, and that if you're labeled something that sort of, it leaves your identity fixed in time. And so it's not at all to remove responsibility, right? Someone who has done harm is just as responsible as someone who is labeled an abuser. And I think that it's really important to make space for the possibility of change. So that's a big part of, and that's really the underlying belief in restorative justice, that we are trying to move forward in a good way. We're trying to change patterns and structures and behaviors, and to not have people be someone who is an abuser for the rest of their life, right? So, or to be stuck with that label. So, so I think that the first thing that I would say about this fear of the charismatic manipulative person who is doing harm, right, is that it is very easy to get sucked in, and you see so many people getting sucked into believing that this person is so charming and so or so aggrieved themselves by the situation. This is definitively like a tactic that is used, or a way in which people show up in the world to keep an abusive scenario going on, to keep power over. And to that end, it is incredibly important that we work with folks who are skilled at seeing this dynamic in play, seeing this behavior manifesting itself. And that it is important for those of us who facilitate to not be the kinds of people who get sucked into this behavior. I literally heard someone in a recent training say, I collude, and I get sucked into that behavior. And I was so grateful that this person was able to name that about themselves, right? That is a beautiful thing to be able to say. Somebody who works in the field of domestic violence was able to say this, and to really to own this. And so a part of it is in co-facilitation, which we'll talk about later, but it's so important to if you find that you have any tiny bit of this, right? Like I personally may err in the opposite direction. I have zero capacity for this. My father was very charismatic. And I used to sit through, dinner parties and people just loved my father, right? And so it was very easy for me to sit there as a child and be like, oh, you have no idea, like, what's going to happen when you leave this dinner party, right? And so I have very little tolerance for it. And I know, but I have other blind spots. And so it's really important for me to co-facilitate with people who don't have the blind spots that I have, right? So it's important, if you're personally sucked into this kind of behavior, to be able to own it without judgment and to co-facilitate with someone who is really good at sniffing that out, right? And trained in seeing that kind of behavior, and is trained in understanding how it is that we dial people back from it. Preparation is also really key. Having other supporters in the room is crucial. Also, again, the answer is going to be to almost every one of these questions, ask the survivor about the ways in which this could be manipulated, right? Calling it out, like asking the survivor to understand, to help us understand the ways in which that manipulation, how the charismatic behavior operates within their family, within their support groups, within their support network. And I think it's also important to have someone in the restorative justice process that the person who's causing harm listens to. Who do they respect? Who calls them out on their behaviors like this, on their BS, and make sure that person is in the circle, right? When you have someone who uses these kinds of behaviors, it is really important to have someone else in the circle who, not just the facilitators, but also someone else from their lives who can call them on that, and really call them in on that, to someone that they respect enough to be able to listen, to see that this is the behavior that they're manifesting. If the question was, what do we do about those people not being willing to take even the fundamental levels of responsibility in order to be in the circle, then I think that there's a question there about whether or not the case is amenable to restorative justice, right? So there's a basic level of acceptance of responsibility that is required. So if these sorts of behaviors are manifesting as blame shifting, to the degree to which we're not even really getting at the fact that there is abuse occurring, or that the abuse is operating in a direction that it is clearly operating in, then this case may not be amenable to restorative justice. But I wouldn't rule out people with certain behavioral characteristics if they're willing to take some level of responsibility, and that the family community can work with further eroding that those kinds of behaviors. So that's the next one. I'm going to keep moving on. How are those who have done harm held accountable for what they promised to do? And what happens if they do additional harm? So I think this really depends on whether or not you're working with the state, right? So let's say that ultimately we have programs where a district attorney, for example, is sending a case to with the full voluntariness of all parties, right? That this is a case that the survivor doesn't want to go to court, but is still interested in an accountability process. That in my dream world, we are having police, probation, district attorneys, other entities, as well as the community could go directly to restorative justice if they wanted it, but that we could also have other mechanisms, right? So if you're working in relationship to the state, right, that kind of makes it, quote unquote, easier in a sense, or not, right, depending on the mindset of the person who's doing harm. So let me take a step back here. So what that looks like is, if a case is being diverted to restorative justice, with the understanding that if restorative justice doesn't work out, that there's still the potential for prosecution on the back end, that's the way we do our youth diversion programs. And there's an upside and a downside to this, right? It could be that the sort of carrot stick of the state can encourage participation. On the other hand, it could dissuade a depth of sharing. So that's a possibility, that if somebody has agreed to a plan to repair the harm and that plan is not completed, or a new level of a safety plan that is agreed to collectively as an outcome of this process, then if that doesn't work out, if that breaks down, then, the state sort of is always there as a potential for enforcement. That being said, there are other ways in which this could be imagined, right? So my ideal thinking on how this is going to be employed, right, is for those couples who choose to, or people who have had past relationships but remain in relationships around their children where there's been violence in the past, who choose to stay in continued relationship, right? It is the family and community continuing the circle, particularly in intimate partner violence situations, where there are continual reconvenes to say, as often as is needed in the beginning, probably fairly frequently, and as time continues, and depending on what stressors are happening in the lives of the folks involved, et cetera, how are folks doing, and how has the violence been in the relationship, right? Is it reducing instead of increasing? Is it has it been there at all? Is really a continued conversation that relies on relationship. And it may be that there are continued sort of like this is going to go on for 6 months, 8 months with a facilitator until family and community have figured out how to continue this without continued facilitation from sort of an outside person in a sense. But this is what this is what accountability could look like. I also think that there are other things that can exist in relationship to it, like continued involvement in a batter's intervention program or something similar to that, where someone stays in an additional ongoing thing that helps them be telling the truth about what is going on with them and in their relationship, so that accountability can be sort of spread, not just through the circle, but external to that. And then if there's additional harm that's done, it's sort of the same answer, right? That this is something that folks can agree to in advance, right? What are going to be what are sort of the deal breakers? What are the this relationship isn't going to continue, or we're not going to continue this process if, and what will happen? What I think can be very powerful about a restorative justice process, something we use with young people who have committed sort of other kinds of harms. Let's say you agree to complete this plan to repair a harm to the person whose house you burglarized, and if you fail to do it, what's going to happen? So what else are you going to need to do? When the person who's done the harm is the person agreeing to this, it makes it that nobody's externally imposing something onto them, right? They have agreed to this in advance, and so there's a way in which that can really help de-escalate feelings of the kind of power dynamic that can arise in people's lives where then they feel like something's being done to them and then they're going to push back on it. So that feels important to have be a part of the conversation. We are moving forward in a good way. We are moving towards less and less violence. What happens if additional harm happens? What's our plan in advance on that? So the next question is, what do you do if people involved in the process support or otherwise collude with the person who did the harm? So this is very similar to the other question that I had, and it's interesting, how similar it is both with the facilitators who might notice that there's some tendency to collude, right? Should you even be there as a facilitator, right? And the same question is, who should be in the circle, right? So if there are support people who are colluders, that's not really a good match for the restorative justice process. And there are wonderful tools, lots of wonderful tools. So the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective has this beautiful tool, this pod mapping tool that can be used as a part of who should be sort of in your world, who is your pod, who is your community around helping you deal with ongoing violence in your life. But also, that's something that we could use in terms of helping sort through who might you even want in that circle, right? There's another tool of concentric circles that we often use in social work. Social workers use this tool where, like, who are the closest people in your life, and then there's sort of the next layer of people out in your life, and then there's third sort of furthest out layer of people in your life. And then really looking at what role does this person play in my life? How do they support me? And also asking the person who's done the harm, who are those people in your life who really support you? And then pushing that to the next question. Do they support you no matter how you're behaving, right? I have a dear person in my life who always talks about how her mother, when she's wrong, her mother doubles down on how right she is, right? And so we need to be able to honestly ask those questions. Say, who helps you be your best self, right? And really asking the survivor, asking their supporters, like, questions around collusion. Do you feel like you get sucked into his story that it's her fault? Do you feel yourself, right? And say, what do you need to support yourself to not do that? So preparation is really key. Preparing the supporters is really key, and really being realistic about who can be in the circle. Every single person that is close to you does not need to be there. So are there different restorative justice approaches for intimate partner violence versus sexual assault? I think the bigger question is whether or not there are different approaches to ongoing versus situational things, right? So if it's a singular time that a thing has happened, I think that the questions, the preparation that we need for dealing with this level of violation and this kind of violation is actually quite similar. When I think about having prepped someone to go into a teen dating violence dialogue versus prepping someone to go into a sexual assault dialogue, the things that we grapple with in talking with a survivor are quite similar. They are really about shame, about self-blame, about why did you do this to me? There's questions of reputation that come up. And so the preparation around the underlying harm is very similar. But if the relationship is ongoing, then there needs to be additional assurances that are sort of deeper when the relationship is ongoing about how are we going to be sure that you're not going to do this to me? Where with the situational ones, the question tends to be like, how are we going to be sure you're not going to do this to anyone else? With ongoing relationships, or where people stay in the same school, in the same community, in the same family, the questions are more about, like, what do we need as a what does the community that we are in need to know in order to see whether or not this is escalating again, for me to be assured that you're not going to continue to do this. These are the kinds of questions, but kind of ongoing, not just personal work that the person who's done harm needs to do, but the ongoing relational work that the two have to do in order to know that this isn't going to happen again. So, so really, particularly around safety planning, I think is the big difference. And I think it's also important to just remember that sexual assault can be often in the context of unseen intimate partner violence. So it's important to be able to not necessarily separate out those two in our minds, and more think of it as ongoing versus situational. So this is a really beautiful and important question. What if the person who has done harm also has a history of victimization? Is that addressed through an RJ process? If so, how? So this is a big both and, right? So I would start with saying that I have never really talked with anyone who does harm who doesn't also have a history of victimization. This is particularly true in my experience of going into prisons and sharing with the groups that go on inside there, and particularly when it's folks who've done intimate partner violence and sexual harm and other crimes of severe violence. Folks have a history of victimization. Like, it is a false thing, I think, that we, that's another reason why I'm not crazy about these labels, particularly the label sort of like putting people in one bucket versus another. You don't, in my mind, lose your status as someone who's a survivor simply because you have done harm. If any, and the fact that we have drawn that line in our treatment programs and in other things really, I think, has done a great disservice. I'm not saying that it means that all of our treatment programs should be open to people of, of all people at once, but rather that the things that we have done that have denied people the opportunity to look at their past victimization as a root of the harms that they continue to do, I think is a really great disservice to them and to all of us and to our safety. So, so yes, I think that we should be looking at histories of victimization, but I think that it's really important about how we do that and where and when we do that. So in the preparatory work for bringing folks together, we need to go deep on that front, both as a way of creating safety and security in sharing vulnerable things for the person who's done the harm, but also as a way of assuring that that does not take up all the space in the circle when we bring people together. So how would it be beneficial to the survivor is a really important part of this when it ultimately comes to the circle. The survivor may want to know, but the survivor deserves for it to not take up all the space, right, in the restorative justice process. I think that there's also I'm thinking about a scenario in which it was actually a teen dating violence homicide case in which it felt really appropriate that the father of the young man who killed his fiancée said in the circle, I taught Connor how to be angry. I taught Connor this. And I think that it helped contextualize things. It didn't take any of the responsibility off of Connor, in a sense, but it rather gave us a deeper understanding of how it is that we got here, which was something that the surviving parents of the young woman who lost her life really wanted to know. And I think that it helps Connor to this day, when he's serving a 20-year sentence, which could have been life or could have been a life sentence. Look at when he is unpacking his own anger issues, which he really believes that he has, right? To look at roots of that, and neither taking away his own responsibility to unpack that, but also understanding where it comes from and unlearning patterns that he had been taught. So in general, I think whether through restorative justice or otherwise, the histories of victimization must be excavated if we're going to get to the roots of offending. And again, I know that there are many batterers intervention programs who have excluded this and others, not all of them. And so really, I just don't believe in that. We don't believe in that restorative justice. I also just want to say that restorative justice isn't the sole thing needed, right? So while it can be addressed in preparatory work, leading up to the restorative justice process, therapy, other things can be really beneficial in helping people who've done harm sort through their own history of victimization in order to prepare them for this deep work. And I just want to repeat that it can't be a free pass for past or future behavior, right? It is very moving when people who've done harm share the way that they have experienced harm. It is often, we often hear things, sometimes in the circle, that are far worse than anything we could have possibly imagined that this person has lived through. I have heard horrific stories from people who have done horrific harm about things that have happened to them. That's not, that we both need to hold the space for that and not ever let that be a free pass. And I think that without shaming people, it is really important to remind them in a loving and kind way that they are better than this, they are capable of being better than this, they're capable of not passing on what was done to them, that is who their best self is, and that there are many of us who have been terribly victimized as well, who I myself can say that I'm someone who has done harm and doesn't do that harm anymore, right? And that there are degrees of harm. I have done some harm. I have not done the worst things that have happened to me. I think it's really important to be able to name those things. The next question is, how do you prepare survivors for the process? So there could be like an entire webinar. There is actually a 2-day training that I do on this very thing, right? What is the depth of preparation that we need for survivors for this process? Really, that both there is the standard restorative justice preparations for coming into a dialogue with the person who's harmed you, and those are really focused around these questions of how have you been harmed? What do you need? Whose obligation is it to meet those needs? What does that look like, right? What are the causes from your side, right? There are all of these beautiful questions that we ask survivors, and survivors often say like, wow, this is the first time anyone has ever asked me these sorts of things, right? But in addition to that, we do need to do safety planning. Particularly with these crimes, take time and more time to allow people to change their minds, and possibly do lots of support circles with them and with their supporters before face-to-face dialogue. So like, Circle is a wonderful preparatory tool, particularly for us to really understand whether or not there's true support from the supporters and collusion. That I really like doing circles in advance with survivors and their supporters, and then circles in advance with the person who's done harm and their supporters to really understand what it is separately before we bring people together. But this really is the beginning of empowerment and autonomy and getting to have a say in things. And it's really important for us, again, as facilitators, particularly, not just particularly survivor facilitators, but for all of us as facilitators, to be able to sit with the fact that people may want really, really different things than we might want for ourselves. So again, I could spend 3 years on this slide, but I'm going to keep going because it is a much deeper question. There are tons of tools and processes and circles that we do in getting survivors ready to really inventory deeply all of the harms that they've suffered and all of their needs as they define them coming out of that. So what is involved in preparing facilitators? And how do they know they are fully prepared and able to avoid colluding? This is like an ongoing, all the questions are about collusion, which I think is great. I love that this is a question. And so I will talk a little bit about sort of at the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice, we generally go through a series of trainings with people who are working with us. Everybody needs to start with implicit bias training, like just generally. I think everybody who does anything that deals with any humans anywhere in America or the world should do implicit bias training to just understand what it is that we bring as facilitators to whatever work it is that we do. And then we do a basic circle training, and then we ask people to practice doing circle. And this is not harm circles. This is just how do you do circle, period. Then we come back and do a harm circle training where we add elements of how do you do harm circle training in intimate partner violence and sexual harm. In my dream world, then you would go practice that, right? Doing harm circle trainings where people are looking at, and you can start doing other kinds of harms, right, too, just before you move into intimate partner violence and sexual harm, right? So it's really important to practice before moving on to the next training, which then we do family group conferencing training, restorative community conferencing training. Those are the two main models that we work in, circle and conferencing. And then we tend to follow up with continued trainings around, special trainings around meeting victims' needs. I think it would be really great if we also developed additional trainings on how to work with folks who've done these particular harms. I think this is a beautiful thing we could develop, again, in relationship with folks who've been thinking deeply about this. Men who've been doing like Men Stopping Violence, my dream to be able to take time and work with Men Stopping Violence for a while and really learn from them. From Jerry Theo and the work that those folks do. You know, there's so many people who've thought deeply about what it is to be in circle with folks who have both experienced and done harm in their lives. And then I think it's also really important for anyone who's working in this field, I mentioned this in the beginning, whenever there's any kind of different subject matter, right, that particularly involves power differentials, hate crimes, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, that people also have extensive experience working in these areas, right? I know that Nuri Nusrat is my coworker here and leads this work with me on intimate partner violence and sexual harm. And she's so thoughtful about like going out and doing the 40-hour Baywar training and the really, Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective trainings, and really thinking deeply about her own need for understanding before she goes out and does this work, right? I myself have been a rape crisis counselor. I've worked in domestic violence shelters, domestic violence hotlines. I've done that work extensively in my 20s and early 30s, and really, and I keep needing a refresher, right? I need to keep myself up to date on what it is that the field is continuing to learn. So, it's a combination of all of those factors. And in terms of collusion, again, really important. I can't say it enough. Work in pairs, like work in pairs. Co-facilitation is always, to my mind, a must because there's always things that we miss, and but it's super, super important to do it when you are doing intimate partner violence and sexual harm. There are things we miss. A lot of self and other assessment is important. A part of our trainings involve assessment tools, self-assessment tools, right? And really just doing a gut check on, was I colluding? Was I getting sucked into a story there that I shouldn't have been getting sucked into? To my mind, the definition of unconditional love is being able to excavate all of the yuckiest parts of ourselves, including us as facilitators, and say, hey, this is my blind spot, or this is where I collude, or this is where I, and I feel really blessed in when I'm working with Nuri to be able to, we can say these kinds of things to each other, like, hey, did I do this, or did you see this in me, or hey, you said this thing that didn't quite sit right, why did you say that? And it's not just, we're never going to be perfect, but it's really important to bring that with love, like I sort of call it, bring it to the source with love, like don't stew about it, lovingly raise it, and raise it from an I statement, right? Like, I noticed this and this wasn't sitting right with me. Can you tell me what was going on for you in your mind when you said this thing or did this thing? My co-facilitator in the beginning of my work with youth diversion, Denise Curtis, she had this same amazing capacity to be like, hey, what were you thinking on that? And I would say the same thing to her too, like, why'd you do this? And sometimes she'd tell me something, I'd be like, wow, that was brilliant. I didn't see it that way, right? Or that was your, that was your way of raising a question in a way that that person could hear it. And it's even okay sometimes when you're co-facilitating when someone to say, hey, it wasn't okay with me when you did this. This is what being in deep community with our co-facilitators is about. We have to practice what it is that we're trying to facilitate, even amongst ourselves, right? And there are a couple situations where I did have to say to co-facilitators, that was not okay. Like, that did not feel okay with me at all that you said that, or that you asked that question, or that you let that slide. I have said that to co-facilitators. And I think we really have to have the courage to be able to do that, and to be in deep enough community and relationship with our co-facilitators to do that. So next, how is restorative justice different from mediation? So it's not always, and this is a nervous, I say this with some trepidation because I know that we've had this long-standing, like, you cannot do mediation for domestic violence is a thing, and it's an important thing. It is a thing, and we should be, the ways in which mediation had played itself out in family court in the past is not at all what we are talking about doing. That kind of thing, it very much focused on reconciliation. It focused on coming to a shared understanding or some place in the middle of two people's stories. That is not at all what we were talking about. Or the way I talk about mediation, the way you're trained in law school, right, is like if everybody's miserable in the end, then you had a good outcome, right? Like everybody had to give something up. When we are talking about the safety of survivors, we are never talking about somebody giving something. We can't be giving that up. Like, that's not a thing to give up. So that being said, mediation has changed a lot over the years. And so I get a lot of pushback from community mediators who say, you really need to stop saying RJ is not mediation, RJ is not mediation, because there are some people who practice mediation today in ways that doesn't look different than restorative justice. Which is to be focused on accountability and safety and meeting the needs of the person harmed, right? So that is, so it's it's hard because, a lot of people define restorative justice differently. A lot of people define mediation differently. This is very much about a term of how do we define these terms? So that's the struggle with really answering that question. How is restorative justice different from mediation? I would simply say, first and foremost, that it's not about focusing on reconciliation, not about driving the parties to some place in the middle, and that it should never be that. And bad restorative justice facilitators might treat it that way, right? There are people who say restorative justice is about forgiveness. I can't say how often I've heard people say that. That is not at all the way that we conceptualize restorative justice. Restorative justice may result in people letting go of anger about some particular things that have happened in the past, but it should never be at the expense of safety, things of that nature. And so that's, I think that's a primary difference. So what are the elements, primary concerns, and policy considerations when planning and developing a restorative justice program? So these things are true regardless of whether or not it's one for intimate partner violence or not, or sexual harm or any other harms that folks do. The first and foremost thing that I wanted to think about is racial and ethnic disparities. How is it that we think about, conceptualize our work with an eye towards meeting the needs of those who are not getting their needs met by our current system? In my own personal experience, it was a fear of potential immigration consequences for my family, a fear of my father being locked up that caused me to not contact the system, right, to not seek help. Even as a child, I knew that what was on offer was not what my family needed in order to heal, right? So whether or not it's survivors who are being pushed into the corner by not being able to access the system, or outcomes when we engage with systems that are more severe for us than for others. That, I think, is a really important piece to take into consideration. And so there are ways in which this can be done on a number of fronts, but I really do think that starting with thinking deeply about how racial and ethnic disparities are playing themselves out in all directions in the work that you're trying to do is critical. The next piece that I would say as a sort of a critical part of restorative justice is having an agreement with your district attorney in your county that allows all conversations that happen in restorative processes to be protected from being introduced in court. So let me be clear about this. This doesn't mean that cases can't ultimately get prosecuted. It simply means that the conversations that happen inside a restorative justice process are privileged and confidential. If we don't do that, then we really are setting up all the parties for potentially being subpoenaed to testify, including facilitators, to be subpoenaed to testify about what happened in court. I've heard too many people working in the arenas of intimate partner violence and sexual harm who are okay with that. I've worked with folks who are working in university contexts, et cetera, saying, well, of course we'd hand over our files in restorative justice processes where we're doing sexual assaults on college campuses to the police. Like, we have to do that because of this, or we have to do that because of that. And I don't think that people are being sufficiently told that that is a possibility. Like, while you're dealing with sexual harm over here on the school campus side of things, you are opening yourself up to prosecution on the other. And there are a lot of survivors who don't want that, right? And so I don't think that we are being, I don't think we're being honest or fair about potential consequences of participation when we are not considering those potential consequences. So what we work with district attorneys. We work with district attorneys to create what we've been calling sort of quote-unquote reverse Miranda. It's a terrible name. We have to come up with something else for it, but basically what it is because Miranda is a good thing to my mind, right? That you want to let people know their right to remain silent. What we offer is something that goes a step beyond that, really. It's what we call beyond Miranda, which is that nothing you say can be used against you in a court of law. Again, if someone had called the police and there was a police report taken, right, that's still something that that could be used later to open a case with, right? But while the case is sitting with restorative justice, nothing that's being said in those preparatory meetings, et cetera, can be used in court. I can't tell you how beneficial this is for getting to the roots of offending, to getting to the roots of the dynamics going on in the relationship, for getting to the whole truth of the severity of the harm. People hold that stuff back when punitiveness is hanging over their heads. Survivors hold information back when the threat of punitiveness is there. And there's a depth of sharing and understanding that happens when folks are protected from the potential legal consequences of conversations in that way. I think it's also important when you're starting something to not start too big or too serious. Really don't bite off more than you can chew. That is a really important consideration when planning for a restorative justice program, right? With the youth diversion stuff, we actually don't start with intimate partner violence because we don't think that there's like a political palatability for it, or it takes a while to find the right folks to do that. So we often say, oh, let's start with burglaries and then work our way out from there. What's been interesting, though, is that there are significant numbers of district attorneys from across the country saying, hey, can we consider doing this with intimate partner violence? That's what our greatest need is. That's where we're not meeting survivors' needs. And so that really has been interesting to try to move in that direction. And even in that, the need is so great. And again, we have to slow down and not try, to bite off more than we can chew. And so what does that look like? To be honest with ourselves about our own capacity. I think another thing in your planning for your policy on the political side of things, there's this whole fear of like, what happens the first time you do RJ and he kills her, right? I think it's really, I apologize, I keep using very gendered language, right? What happens the first time that someone is killed after it's gone to restorative justice? I think it's really important to name that the current system is also failing, right? And failing miserably. Really, return to those statistics. 50% of survivors not contacting the system in the first place. We actually increase a lack of safety when the greatest chances of people being killed is when the police have been called, right? And this is not to blame the police. It's just not the right set of tools for dealing with these harms, right? So we hear this from police officers all the time, right? They are ill-equipped to manage these situations. This is not the right set of tools for this harm. So it's really important that I think that we, without shaming wonderful district attorneys and wonderful police officers who dedicate their lives to trying to help on these kinds of things, right? It's also really important to name from a place of compassion that it's not working. What we are doing is not working, or at least not working for this huge percentage of the population. And to frame that in a non-blaming and shaming way, but rather to come to particularly systems partners that we're working with from a place of how can we bring this tool to the toolbox? And I hate to reduce restorative justice to a tool. It really is a way, and it's a wonderful way of moving forward in a good way, but it is something that people can see that way, right? Hey, less than 3% of child sexual abuse cases results in conviction, and even then, it doesn't reduce recidivism. So what could we be doing to help? Because we all want to end child sexual abuse. We all want to do that. So how do we start to explore the possibility of this? Let's look to places where that has been done and see what we can learn from them so we can actually end CSA. The next, related to that, I think a place that we don't have any answers right now is around immigration and child protective services, right? When we're mandated reporters, I really struggle now also on the immigration front, right? We are hearing from jurisdictions that we want to work with that they are required if we're working in relationship to the state to report to ICE. This is devastating. I don't have answers, unfortunately, but it is a policy consideration that I hope that we will be able to be working more deeply on with that. And really where I struggle with what it looks like to support the work that has been and always will continue to be happening, quote unquote, off the grid. So those are some answers on that front. So how do we as advocates balance victim survivors' decision to access the criminal legal system while still trying to move away from it? It's a beautiful question too. So from my side, I'm just always about the survivor. like, what do they want? And then you have to decide, is that something that you can do? And then if not, without any judgment, handing them over to someone who does the thing that you can't do, right? So for me, I don't work with the state, right, so much on certain things, right? Like I don't work in, I'm not a victim advocate anymore that works out of the DA's office, right? So what it is that here's the thing we have on offer over here that is operating next to the system or circumventing the system. And if you want to prosecute this person, right, this is who you would call to follow up with that. Or here's the name of the victim advocate from the DA's office. And really just giving them the warm handoff. If that is not, but to do it with like really zero judgment, it is so important that as sort of we not make survivors feel like they are sellouts or that we're not living their lives, right? And so I fear this from in any direction, right? We don't want to be coming to survivors from a place of you should have called the cops or you should have, right? And we at the same time we don't want to, because we don't know what the consequences of that are for that person. On the other hand, we don't want to be like, you should never call the cops, it makes you less safe, or we don't want to throw statistics at people or our own politics at people in any direction. So, and for me, it's just about knowing what is my gift and my skill and my capacity, and just saying this is what I can do and this is what I can't do, but this is someone who can. So that's generally the way I approach that. Just doing a little time check here. Forgive me for pausing for one moment.
You're doing great.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you. I'm a little behind, but I'm going to continue on. So next slide. Have there been any evaluations of restorative justice processes? Yes, there is a meta-analysis of none on ongoing face-to-face dialogue, none on face-to-face dialogue with ongoing intimate partner violence or in the sexual harm context with ongoing. What I would say is look to the work more broadly of Sherman and Strang, and they wrote a report called Restorative Justice, the Evidence, and it is a meta-analysis of international data. Again, in the youth diversion context, you can look on the Impact Justice webpage for a study that we put out on our first ever study on youth diversion with pretty serious crimes, including some, we didn't disaggregate because the number was too small, of teen dating violence and sexual assault cases, but they are mixed in there. And that shows a 44% reduction in recidivism and a 91% satisfaction rate for participating survivors. And I did look at the data, and again, it was not statistically significant, but the survivors of sexual harm and intimate teen dating violence scored very high on the, they were in the high victim satisfaction range. Again, can't give a number because it was just a handful of cases, but it was that those survivors were extremely satisfied with the process. And so what I would say is, also, I believe that there was some work out of Pima, Arizona, the program there, that there are reports on the successes of that in the sexual assault context. So Mary Koss's work, KOSS, and that program is no longer in operation, but there's some stuff there. I know Linda Mills is studying some things that she is working on now with regard to, it's not, again, face-to-face dialogue and participatory decision-making. It's folding restorative justice processes into, restorative justice elements into what are traditional batterers intervention. And that, I believe, I'm not sure if, I just saw her speak about it, and I can't remember where they are on the publication of that information. In terms of data. There's much that's been written about it more broadly, but in terms of like actual qualitative or quantitative research at this point. I don't think that we have anything, definitively don't, on face-to-face dialogue and with ongoing intimate partner violence and sexual harm. And again, I just repeat that this is very new, and I hope that people will start to look at it and to understand it, and tweak it as we learn from studying it. So, you know, I think my favorite and my most influential, the thing that influences my work the most is Hollow Water. And so I may have mentioned this in the last webinar, but Hollow Water is a community in Manitoba, Canada, where they had a pandemic of child sexual abuse. It's really important to contextualize it. It's an Ojibwa community, and a generation and a half ago at this point, right? Can you have half a generation? I don't know, 2 generations ago. An entire generation of children were stolen from the reserve there and sent to boarding schools where they were all sexually and physically abused. Many children were murdered. And they were returned to their community, and within a few decades there was a pandemic of child sexual abuse, true and domestic. Well, it started with alcoholism. There were women who came together in circle, and you know, they were coming together to talk about the alcoholism pandemic that was growing in their small community. And through those conversations, they all started to name that they had been sexually abused as children in boarding schools, and then they were, and then many of them were admitting the degree to which sexual abuse was happening in their community at astronomical rates. Over 80% of children saying they were sexually abused. Over 40% of adults self-identifying that they were sexually abusing children in their families and in this small community. And so this happened in Canada, where there's a very different approach to Indigenous people's autonomy. And so what happened was, in relationship with the Crown, with the government there, they came up with a plan whereby a restorative justice process would happen in a good and healing way that both protected the children and ultimately reunified children who had been sexually abused by even their own parents, right, back into their homes. And so there's a very powerful film that you can watch. It's free and available online, the Canadian Film Review Board. I can't say enough good stuff about watching this film. Brace yourself. It is very powerful to watch children sitting in circle with their parents and saying, yeah, Dad really screwed up, and now I feel completely safe with him, right? And what does it take for us to build the kinds of families and communities together that can be really honestly excavating these things and going really, again, like, what is so brilliant about this film is it shows going all the way back to the roots. I don't know if the version that's online anymore contains all the stuff about the relationship of the boarding school crisis to the sexual harm that ultimately happened. There are shorter and longer versions of the film, but I think it's really, really important to think about the depth of work that happened and the way in which deep community is required for doing this really well. So that is something that I'm thinking about. And I would just say, from my own personal experience, it's something that I'm really excited to reconvene in the future, and something that I have simply not had the capacity to do, is starting that process here in the United States. So I am a child sexual abuse survivor of South Asian descent. I believe really firmly that our true revolutions in our healing journeys individually come through collectively, through collectivity. And so I had a brief, Nudi and I co-facilitated a brief, it was like 6-8 weeks. There were some continued relationships from that, circle for South Asian survivors, South Asian American survivors of child sexual abuse. And we just started to name those questions, right? We got through how was I harmed and what did I need? And then really whose obligation is it to meet those needs, and what does getting those obligations operationalized look like? And so that next layer of conversation that we were starting to open up. What was interesting to me is even as we began to scratch the surface of those questions, that nobody said, I want to see my abuser locked up. I want to see the person who harmed me locked up. Nobody said those words. There were, again, it's not like an N equals 8 or 9 study, right? It's not a big enough group for me to, have data to prove it. But it was a very powerful thing to hear. I want the community to know that this is happening, right? And it really redoubled my efforts about breaking silence within our own cultural community. What does it look like for us to start to say things amongst ourselves out loud, and for us to start to think about culturally specific responses that would be beneficial amongst our own group. I also think that it's really important as a diasporic community to be thinking about this in relationship to folks who are doing the work in our countries of origin. So I've had the incredible blessing over this past year of connecting with multiple organizations in India working to end child sexual abuse. And it is through deep dialogue and community with the people doing amazing work there, and they have become interested in restorative justice, right? And so going there and learning from them about culturally specific things that I could be applying in my own cultural community here, but also having the opportunity to train folks there in restorative justice, or to be in restorative justice community with people there, and then having them come here. 2 people recently this summer were here from 2 major organizations in India, and just continuing that conversation. So very exciting stuff, very exciting stuff. So the last thing was around resources, books, articles. I think that Sue O, correct me if I'm wrong, we put out a list of books. More than anything else, what I want to tell people to do is get trainings on circle process for starters. I got mine first one from Kate Pranis. I've done many other circle trainings and family group conversing trainings, and victim offender dialogue and crimes of severe violence with Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz, and defense-initiated victim outreach trainings with so many different people. I've really benefited from Kelly Branham, the thinking of Tammy Krause, so many people who've done amazing work in restorative justice more broadly, and learning how to fold those things in, right? Reading lots by Howard Zare and Justice Robert Yazzie on Navajo justice, reading Donna Coker, reading so many people who influenced my thinking, and then starting to fold those things into the work that I do. And then really, again, I just want to say, a talk that I recently gave at this International Restorative Justice Conference in Vermont was called Physician Heal Thyself, right? And I mean this with a really, from a place of good heart. Like, we have a lot of work to do as individuals and within our own communities to understand how it is that we can look at applying restorative justice to our own healing journeys individually and collectively. Because I think that it's important not to try to go fix something else until we've fixed it within ourselves. Not that it's ever fully fixed. I see my own survivor journey as an onion, and as I peel layers away. And I see healing that needs to happen in my own communities as an onion, that layers need to be lovingly peeled away until we get closer to this tender core part of what we all are working towards. So I think with that, I think we actually did it, Sue. Did we get through all the other questions? Yes. Oh my goodness.
Yes, we did. There are questions. Just a quick comment about the resources. We do have a list here that is very preliminary, and thank you to Donna Coker, who's on this webinar, for helping to find some URLs so you could get some of the journal articles easily, because we know everyone does not have access to journals. We are collecting information, and my email, I'll put it in the chat after I finish here. If you can send it, we'll put them together and share them back out. I do want to give a quick shout out. On page 2 of those resources at the very bottom is a newsletter that the Wisconsin Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that is now called End Domestic Violence Wisconsin, put out October 2017, is a great newsletter that has lots of different information, including a video of Sujata and information about work Donna has done, but information about work other people have done. And it's just, I really encourage you, if you have not looked at it, to get it. So with that, let me move on to some of the questions, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So this one is interesting. This Denise, who works at Praxis in Minnesota, she wrote, how does restorative justice address systemic causes of gender-based violence and other harm that is rooted in systemic dominance and oppression? Much of what you describe seems individualized as opposed to systemic.
Yep, that is a feeling of the individualized application of restorative justice, right? And so there's all the things are happening, right? This is transformative justice's big critique of restorative justice, and I think it's really legitimate. I think that where restorative justice can, as you know, things that happen under the umbrella of restorative justice can get to those sorts of things is when we're thinking way bigger, like truth and reconciliation. And that's going to be my closing slide. Two slides away. But I really think that we need to be thinking about truth and reconciliation. We need to be looking at the bigger systemic things that have given rise to the dynamics, right? All of these things have to be happening simultaneously. While there is, I struggle a lot with facilitators that when we are facilitator training and talking about this specific thing, because we don't want to introduce something that young people, particularly, or folks who have experienced harm or done harm, may feel like this individual harm that is happening is getting sidelined by the bigger questions of when we keep peeling the layers of the onion, right? One of those onions is structural oppression and patriarchy, big layers, right? I have seen it done indelicately, where people are basically just bringing their political lens into the conversation in a way that can be problematic. I see it as more something that happens in prep with both folks, and I allow people to, in the circle itself, people are going to talk about what they want to talk about. I'm very quiet. If we've done sufficient preparatory work in the leading up to the conference, I say very, very little. When I think about that homicide case I did, it went on for 5 hours. And I think I said 5 sentences the entire time, because there had been deep work and thinking on where did these things come from, and the parties were going to bring what they wanted to bring to the conversation. But that being said, each individual restorative justice situation that occurs, right, with each individual restorative justice process, isn't the big picture. It isn't going to also do truth and reconciliation, which to my mind also needs to happen, that we need to have much larger conversations as a nation and within our movements about the bigger forces at play.
And Donna just posted a link to some of the work that Jennifer Lewin is doing. So that's great, because, we were recently at a conference about restorative justice, and it was just really interesting also to hear about the work that people are doing about environmental restorative justice processes. So I learned a lot. So that was very good.
Jennifer's session was the one I was really sad that I missed. I was somewhere else at that time, but more answers to the question that was just asked may be there in Jennifer's work.
So thank you, Donna, for all those postings, and thanks, Dot, and other people have been posting things there. It's just really helpful. And Sujata, as I said with last time, we'll copy out the chat for you so you can have a copy of it. Okay, so you can see everything. A question, Inez asked actually 2 questions, and thank you for the clarification. That was really helpful. One was, what do you do when the abuser has died without providing an apology? Is there a way of having a process still?
Oh, what a beautiful question. My father passed away before I was able to have a full confrontation. I had a sort of partial confrontation with him when I was 13. It's really what got me started on this path. I didn't realize it until someone asked me a question on a panel about, did you ever confront your father? And I was like, oh my goodness, I did. when I was 13, I just sort of did it sideways. I left home and I came back. I was staying with my teacher, which I guess back in the 1980s, teachers let you move in with them when you were having trouble at home. And my teacher brought me back and we had a conversation. And the single question was basically a restorative justice process. She asked, why do we think Sujata is running away? Why do you think Sujata doesn't want to be at home? I think is the way she framed it. And we went around the circle and we talked about things. And I did actually say it out loud. I said instead, I looked him right in the eye and I said, I don't know, Anu. I called him Anu. I don't know, Anu. Why don't you tell us why you think I'm running away? And he was terrified. And what's interesting is that for the next 2 years, he didn't touch me after that, right? So I use that as an example of like sort of this harm reduction thing. But did he ever actually take responsibility for what he did? Did he say what he did to me? No, I never got those words. And I think that my rage that continued for several years after his death was that how dare he die without taking responsibility for what he did to me, right? And I still was able to have my own healing journey, right? And I think for me, if someone were to sit down with me and say, what do you need? What do you need? I still have needs that are unmet in relationship to the harm, and they usually are related to extended family, right? And so there is always healing that can be done for the survivor. So to sit down with me now and say, he's gone, right? What do you need? Nobody will ever be able to stand in for him. Surrogacy conversations have been very beneficial to me, right? We're sitting in circles and watching other people apologize to other people as a facilitator has been incredibly healing for me. But my healing journey has had to continue without ever hearing the words directly from my father. And so that is, but there are other things. There are still other needs that could be met, and there are other ways in that people could ask me that question. I have answers. So thank you for that beautiful question. So important.
So I have 6 questions I want to ask you, so we're not going to be able to do that. But I just want to give a shout out to how you started, actually, when you were talking about funding, and just really want to underscore that. And I really love the idea of having it be a learning process among practitioners and funders, and I think that's something we should circle back to, because I think it's just really important how success gets defined. So that was really great. So thank you for that. One of the things about the facilitator training that really struck me is that you said, you need to start with implicit bias training, and then and that makes a lot of sense, and then you gave us some really good suggestions about some of the next steps. And then way earlier you talked about how facilitators we really need to know ourselves to be able to do this work well. And that just goes way beyond implicit bias training. Like, do you have any suggestions, like who gets to decide who's actually evolved enough to do this work?
Nobody. So here's the thing, I don't know. I don't believe in, like, you get the Sujata baliga certificate, like, then I've created like a, chain of, like, it's the McDonald's of restorative justice and you get the certificate. We don't do any of that, right? And I think that the professionalization to me is an extremely dangerous gatekeeping thing that we must not do with restorative justice. It is, I've heard terrible stories about, like, people who were raised doing circle in their indigenous, community for generations, and that they didn't get a job at some school restorative justice thing because they didn't have the certificate from the local restorative justice certificate giver, right? And I don't think that certificate tells us whether or not we've done the deep work. To my mind, one of the most important things is keeping a circle keeper's circle going. If you also need therapy. If you also need, hopefully you do. But the bottom line is that there are people who have not worked out their stuff in every field. There are doctors, there are psychiatrists, there are psychologists, there are lawyers who have not worked out their internal stuff. It is just I offer this as an invitation. I have not worked out all my stuff. Right? I've worked on a lot of it for a really long time, but I've not worked it all out by any stretch of the imagination. And I think I just offer this as an invitation for whatever area of work that we're doing, to give yourself the time and space to assess, like, what is going on with me in relationship to this work. But I think being in community with people who can lovingly let you know when they're worried about you, when you're caring too much, that's the thing I worry about the most with us in this field, is that we start to turn into the people that we don't want to be, or we don't want to have, harming other people because we carry too much. And so I think that that's really, really, self-care feels like a too shallow of a thing, right? This is much deeper than that. But if starting with self-care works, that's great. I just don't want self-care to become another thing that we beat ourselves up for not having done enough of that. That really didn't answer your question at all, Sue. But
no, it's a huge amount of work. And I mean, one of the lessons that I keep learning from you is that it's an ongoing process. It's not a thing you learn and then stop and go and do it. And so that's just been really helpful. I'm also really cognizant of the time, and you have 2 more slides. So why don't we hand it back over to you to finish this up.
Okay, great.
And thank you. It's just great.
Yeah, you bet. So this is, we started to touch on this a little bit. Thank you, Sue, so much. And this is one of the things that I think that we really want to think about within the context. I had this slide on the last webinar too, and I just really want to repeat this. So there are many people who in the 70s and 80s, and myself included, the late 80s and early 90s, who feel that we were questioning criminalization as the singular response to to domestic violence and sexual harm. And we were saying, hey, this isn't going to work out well for our communities, right? And many of us were exited from meetings, from movements, from conferences, literally made to leave. And I think that it's really important that we revisit this conversation, to walk our talk. What would it look like for us to have a truth and reconciliation process within the domestic violence movement? Again, when we start with a healed bedrock, then we can move on from there. Before we even start to all jump in and start doing restorative justice and domestic violence, how is gatekeeping, how are pushing out voices of critique and dissent and actually wisdom, rather, being excluded? Even again, like we could replicate the entire thing that we are trying to have to put right now. And this doesn't mean throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? Like, that's a really terrible expression. We should actually not use that expression. But this doesn't mean that there weren't some positive things that came from the decades of hard work that people have done to reduce violence against women, reduce intimate partner violence. We've made some really wonderful strides. And there are other things that went terribly wrong. And those are based in structural approaches that are exclusionary. And I think that it would be really important for us to model this from jump with compassion and accountability in our truth and reconciliation. And what that means isn't, oh, we understand why people did this and let's forget this, in the same way that we wouldn't want to use that word reconciliation in a restorative justice dialogue, right, without returning to this land of like the mediation of reconciliation in intimate partner violence. That we don't want to do that amongst ourselves either in the movement, right? So I love this quote by Nelson Mandela, which is, reconciliation does not mean forgetting or trying to bury the pain of conflict, but the reconciliation means working together to correct the legacy of past injustice. And I think that this is really, it feels like a tall order, but when we do it with compassion in our accountability processes, I think that we can really, we could do that. So, and with that, I would just say thank you and onward with solidarity and love for everyone doing this very, very hard work. And thank you very much for everyone who listened in. And really, again, just an invitation to be at the beginning of something thoughtful and collective together. So thank you so much.
And thank you so much. And people have my email address. You have ways of getting in touch with Sujata, and may we continue this dialogue. So thank you so very much. Take care. Talk to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Conference will automatically end in 60 seconds.